in this round, we're going to pressure him to spend some time with us next year again, so we're hoping that we can match some calendars. But I'm just going to, this is a thing that's of particular interest to me. I've been reading and studying Genesis for a long time and getting perplexed, and I've learned things here that I've never seen in the books that I'm reading. But if your curiosity has been piqued, as mine has been all over again by Earl's presentations, I'm just going to recommend a little bit of show and tell stuff that I have that might be of interest to you if you sort of want to just browse or look forward. Earl has been referencing Martin Buber, and Buber and Franz Rosenberg, am I right on that? Yes, in Germany, attempted to do a translation of the Bible, of the Hebrew Bible, into German from Hebrew that would sound and function in the ear and on the mind the way that the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew would have done on those who could read and understand Hebrew. Is that perplexingly stated enough? Anyway, I don't read German, so I could never enjoy that stuff. But Everett Fox, an American scholar, has attempted to do in English what Buber and Rosenzweig did in German, and it produced a very strange translation that is at the same time really enjoyable and challenging, because none of it most of it doesn't look the way we're used to seeing it and hearing it. This is not a book that is meant to be read like a novel, which the NRSV in a sense is. A lot of the peculiarities, as Earl has already pointed out, are a result of, we don't want to repeat the same word over and over and over again because that's bad grammar or bad style in English. It's exactly what's going on, and so he's not afraid to do it. So there are short, clippy sentences, lack of transitional words and things like that, which makes this, and commentary throughout about why it's this way and what the sense of the word is. A really fascinating book. Susan Sherwin put me onto this puppy, and I'm grateful to her. I read this on a trip to North Dakota and couldn't get my nose out of it. It's really wonderful. And you know how exciting it is to drive across North Dakota. An alternate translation is the 5 Books of Moses by Alter. Do you know this one? He attempts to, with much more of an English style in mind, to give a translation that is truer to the language, that picks up on a lot of the stuff going on in the Hebrew that might be lost by reading the standard English translations. And he gives commentary throughout on the book, what's going on in that. He's a really notable linguist. He's done a variety of books. The Art of Biblical Narrative, he's done the Story of David, I don't know what other, I can't remember some of the others. Earl has referred to him as well. He's at Berkeley. This one is also just really fun for the commentary.
Do you have any thin books with pictures?
I don't This has two diagrams. This is a really wonderful commentary, and it's thin. And really wonderfully translated. Klaus Westermann is one of the best Bible scholars that I've read, and he's done this little book to complement his other work on Genesis. This is called Creation, and it's a commentary on the first 11 chapters, showing how they all fit together beautifully. And Earl has picked up themes, and I'm thinking, I know that here. So I really recommend. This book is really old, but it's still really wonderful. And finally, at the University of Chicago, they do a freshman class that's kind of interdisciplinary, and everybody has to read Bible as a part of that. Figure it out, Rockefeller influence or something. Anyway, Leon Cass, who's known not as a Bible scholar at all, he's a bioethicist, I think, was one of the team teachers on this class, and he's not a particularly observant Jew, but he said, I figured if I'm going to be teaching this stuff, I better learn about it. And so he has done essentially a guide to reading Genesis that lays out, here's how it's structured, here's what's going on. Notice there's a wonderful chapter when he gets to the creation, matching up the order of the creation narrative with what science suggests may have been the actual order of evolution. And so really puts to death this thing that you can't sort of think about evolution and be a religious person at the same time. This is also just brilliantly written, even though he is at the University of Chicago. You can understand. And so, That was mainly directed at the law school, but, you know, let it apply to everything. John Marty's not here, so I haven't offended his father, but his daughter. Anyway, we are, as I said, both happy and sad today, because Earl is back for one more round this year, and we hope to welcome him again. But I know I speak for all of us, because most of you have mentioned to me how enlightening, how inspiring, how educational, and how just purely enjoyable this hall has been. And we're really grateful for you to clear your calendar so that you can spend these 4 weeks with us. Thank you very much. Earl Schwartz.
Well, needless to say, it's been my great pleasure. Thanks to Dwight, thanks to Susan, thanks to the foundation, thanks to the congregation. Loved being with you. Appreciate the warm hospitality and thoughtful reflection that we've done together, and as does Nina. It was just a pleasure. Last week, we closed at the opening verses of the 3rd chapter of Genesis. And that's where I'd like to pick up this morning. However, as I noted last week, the 3rd chapter actually begins a verse earlier in the last verse of chapter 2. Let me very briefly say a word about each of the things we've talked about thus far before I return to that point. We've talked about books and words, what books do well and what books struggle to do, the degree to which language is, by definition, a compromised medium for engaging around the kinds of things that the Hebrew Bible intends to help us to explore together. That language is, from the beginning, problematic when talking about such things. And all the more so when we're talking about language across thousands of years, cultural transformations, and different languages themselves. Even more so when the common literary forms, the conventions of storytelling, of narration, that were, as we can see from the biblical text we have today, different in many respects from how you and I might tend to tell stories. All of those challenges meet us whenever we open a Bible. It's a book, it's words in translation, it's words from far away and long ago. And yet, as people of biblical faith, we're called to the challenge of exploring through this book the questions that stand at the heart of our communities. I noted that Genesis 1 through 11 are difficult in their own right. They stand apart from almost everything else in Hebrew Bible in some respects and constitute their own challenges. Beginning with the fact that in the opening 3 words of the text, we already have 2 words that don't make any sense at all. By definition, we have a word that refers to deity, but it's a plural word that takes a singular verb. You might remember that. We have a word for an action, which is that thing that human beings cannot do. We translate it as creation. We're comfortable in English talking about human beings as creators, but not in Hebrew. Once we appreciate the sobering impact of these limitations on our study of these words, I think we are ready to nevertheless engage the text as it presents itself to us. We've looked at some of the common conventions of biblical style, the deeply condensed use of language, the extreme economy terminology, the necessary engagement of our own experience in making sense of the full dimensions of what the text repeatedly only alludes to, the degree to which the greater part of any biblical narrative is implicit, the explicit stated part of the text is just the prologue, the premise, the beginning of a much larger story that requires our active participation for its unfolding. The role of pattern repetition, word play, other common literary devices in the text. And today we'll look at one more as well in just a moment, and that is the use of parallel structures in biblical poetry. That will be our final literary device. When we left off last time, we made some preliminary observations about those first few verses in chapter 3 of Genesis, including the intriguing overlapping use of the word arum, arumim, plural, which can mean in biblical Hebrew both shrewd or sly and naked. And as I suggested, the discussion among biblical scholars as to whether it is in fact the same word, that in some conceptual way biblical thinkers associated shrewdness and slyness with nakedness, or it's a false cognitive, that they're two terms which evolved into something that sounds like the same word, really doesn't make any difference. For the biblical author, it's the pun that's the point. And that seems to be then the point of departure for everything that then follows. So let me read those opening verses to you, and then if you've had a chance to think this over in the last few days, I'd like to ask you what you might see implied in this particular wordplay, kind of a classic biblical example of punning or wordplay. So here's how I would read those verses. Chapter 2, 25. So then the two of them were arumim, naked, sly, the human and his woman, and they were not, and apparently this last word means embarrassed, but it's not entirely clear that that's what that word means. But let's say it does. They were not embarrassed. And the snake was the most arum, naked, sly, of all the creatures of the field that God, the God, had made. And that snake, he said to the woman, so, God said to you, you can't eat from any of the trees in the garden. And she, the woman, said to the snake, we can eat from the trees in the garden. It's from the tree that's in the middle of the garden. That's the one God said, don't eat from it and don't touch it, or you'll die. So let me ask you, any thoughts about this association between the quality with which the human beings are first described in Eden? This seems to be a kind of definitive quality, right? We're not told anything more about them in this version of creation until we get to the fact that they have this quality. And then it would appear, at least for the sake of the pun, that the narrator wants us to keep in mind that this snake has exactly the same quality. So what might that be about? Any thoughts about that arumness that the narrator almost certainly wants us to consider as somehow an intersection, a link, a bridge between these two poles of this initial conversation?
If its slyness can be equated with sin, then it's already present.
Yes, that whatever we're talking about is characteristic of the human being, and that would
And creation.
Yes, And that would qualify our understanding of what would typically be referred to as the fall. That human beings in their innocence, whatever that may mean, does not preclude the possibility that we're like this already. Okay, good. Anything else? Anything else?
Well, take it the other way, that nakedness is the natural state of everything,
Yes.
as opposed to slyness. I mean, that kind of turns it the other way. It doesn't refer to sin so much as exposure to God, or,
Uh-huh.
all known by Him.
Yes. Well, good. I think instead of
He doesn't buy
I'll
it,
see
but-
if there are any more, and then I want to come back to that. Yes,
I
please.
sort of think of slyness as being like creativity, but kind of turned in on itself.
Yeah, I think that's well taken. And especially if it would appear that the pun we have here, as was just suggested, describes something which was intended to be the case with people.
That we have creativity or freedom to think creatively, but then we used it improperly.
Yes, that this isn't a scar that ensues through some kind of mortal wound that we bring upon ourselves. This is something quintessentially human. Good.
Well, we have learned that God created man to have dominion over other creatures, but here's kind of a reversal.
Unless this quality, this slyness, has something to do with our capacity to dominate. That might
the
be true.
snake is
Has the same capacity.
dominant.
Yeah, yes. And the use of this quality, the proper use of this quality, would be, how would one use this quality of slyness, shrewdness well? How would you do that, assuming that the quality was intended for us all along?
We're talking
Well,
about
in terms of his relationship to creation, would be to manage the creation
Managing,
fruitfully.
yeah.
You would think so. It has something to do with planning. Planning and plotting are just a few letters apart from one another. Yes, please. No, it's true.
This is off your point, but I'm intrigued by the fact that this is the first place, I think, where the notion of death comes up. To understand the command of God, you have to understand, what is death all about?
What would that mean? Yes, that's right. If you've never seen it, what would saying "you will die" possibly mean?
Right.
Yeah, good.
Excuse me, I see sort of the snake saying to the woman, I'm one with you.
Yes, we have something in common.
And that's right, and we are different from God, and this is going to be the big play.
And we are different from everyone else. It would appear that pun suggests that these two are meant for one another, the human and the snake. That this shared quality creates a natural affinity. Is that?
And then he can play and God is holding out on us.
And, as we'll see in a moment, she can play the same game. So, let me suggest, in thinking about this, and now I would like to come back especially to your comment, what in fact are the real consequences of eating the fruit? What actually immediately happens?
Self-awareness.
Yeah, but you have to remember the pun. So they eat the fruit, and what do they find out? What do they then know? If we assume that the fruit is the raising of a curtain that has so far veiled something from the human being, and that by eating it, they now see something, what's the only thing they appear to see? What changes? They don't seem to change. They just know one thing. They're naked
In front of God.
arum. Now the word changes slightly to arum. Arum is more commonly translated only as naked. But the pun is already in place. What might it mean if we follow the pun to this point in the story? That the human being eats the fruit, and the consequence is simply that they now know that they are this way, and then what do they do about it?
Hi.
They cover up. Now, what would that mean? That the thing that happens isn't that they don't drop dead. They don't feel some evil coming into their heart. They're not suddenly overwhelmed by libido. At least the text doesn't describe it that way. They don't become increasingly treacherous and villainous all of a sudden. They don't become transformed into some semi-divine being. They seem just as they are, except that they now know, which is what the tree describes itself as being. They now know that quality that they already had, and they cover it. Make of that if you work on both sides of the pun, and they cover it. We're used to thinking of the fig leaves, but now they know that they're, think of it both ways. Now they know that they're naked, yes. Now they know that they're shrewd, sly, plotty. And they
It reads like, I mean, this pushes it a bit, but suddenly it seems to me they become aware of a certain vulnerability. They start hiding things from each other.
Yes.
Out of whatever sense. I mean,
Yes.
it takes on more of the shrewdness aspect as we commonly use the word
Yes.
now.
Yes, I think you're right, and it's an interesting distinction to say, if there is any hint of a loss of innocence in this story, it's not that they weren't this way and now are, it's that they've always been this way, but they now see it. They now see it.
So much for shrewdness.
Well, yeah, and the reaction is entirely then human. We know the reaction. You see this in yourself, and you immediately cover it up. And the implications, if you draw the pun just a bit further, that we know more about our sexuality, not just our sexual organs, but we know more about our sexuality than we would ever want to reveal. We know more about our capacity to plot, to contrive, to misconstrue for our benefit than we would ever want to acknowledge. And we cover it up. We hide, we deflect, and we cover it. Let me just note one more thing about this. The human being is like God before she ever eats the fruit. Where do you see that? Where's the evidence that at the moment she contemplates the fruit, the text very subtly says that she was already like God? You have to, if you have your Bibles, take a look. Look at the wording of verse 6. The opening words of verse 6. Vatera ha'isha ki tov ha'etz. Vatera ha'isha ki tov ha'etz. And then the woman saw, Then the woman saw that the tree was good. She saw that it was good. And there we have the perfect allusion to the divine quality of the human being already. She saw that it was good, just like the Creator 2 chapters ago. She saw that it was good. That's a divine act. To contemplate a thing and to know its nature. She has that capacity before she eats the fruit. What changes is a self-awareness that causes us to hide, to cover it all up.
Is that fear?
Well, what would you describe it as?
Afraid.
Yeah.
Afraid of the potential.
Yeah, and afraid. Is it irrational?
No.
No.
It's been irrational.
Yeah, no, it is, absolutely. Well, we'll come back to it in just a minute. Yeah, I think you can describe it as a kind of fear. That's what the human being says when God seeks them out in the desert. I was afraid. I was afraid because I am this way. I am naked, shrewd, I am afraid. And so I hid.
She realizes she has the quality, but she also realizes that she has no capacity for handling it.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
Exactly.
As we all realize,
Exactly.
over and over again, or limited
It's
capacity.
frightening.
That's frightening.
If she had
Yes,
socks, she would frighten the socks off.
absolutely.
So the awareness and the shrewdness extends not just to the capability, but to the consequences.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Good. I think that that's implicit in the text. That the subtlety of this text, and I don't want to drive it any further because I don't want to just suggest a definitive reading. All I do want to say is that the text is surrounded by this very thoughtful, nuanced ambiguity between nakedness and slyness. What it is that the human beings actually come to see about themselves. And how that's related to what they are already. All of that, I think, is worth thinking about carefully. Let me just say one more thing, and this has been, yes, Susan.
Could it be that they saw themselves as connected to everything at first, and after eating, they saw themselves as separate?
Did we have this conversation last week,
A
Susan?
little bit.
Little bit. Yes, there's an essay in Martin Buber's book, Good and Evil, in which Buber says at the very heart of this new awareness is the consciousness of opposition and the good and evil. First of all, before it has moral significance at all, suggests that there can be something other than me is you, other than this is that, and it's that initial sense of polarity that launches the rest of the consciousness that comes with the fruit. That's right. But they're not part of one single integrated whole because their consciousness now makes the separation. That's what they now see. They're different. They're other. Yep. I think it's a very interesting essay, and I recommend it if you're interested in pursuing the idea. Martin Buber's Good and Evil. One more indication of shrewdness, and this goes back, a long ways in Jewish exegesis of this passage. Rabbinic commentators have long noted that when the snake says, so you can't eat of any of the trees, huh? The human replies, no. It's from the tree in the middle of the garden that God said, don't eat from it. Don't touch it, or you'll die. Now, as I said last week, the famous rabbinic midrash expansion on this is, God never said, don't touch it. That's a quintessential human action to put a second restriction around the real one, break the second, and then use it as a premise for breaking the real one. That's the way we work. So the snake, as I said at the end of our session last time, says, oh, don't touch it, pushes her, she bumps into the tree, she touches it, she doesn't die, and the snake says, I guess that wasn't true, was it? And the rabbinic observation is, she agreed. That wasn't true. What she lost track of was that she had made that up. That was a product of her imagination. And now she was living in that imaginary reality. And if that wasn't true, then maybe that's not true either. Now you don't, once again, have to read the text that way to see that the fact that the woman says something that we don't find attributable to God would appear to suggest the narrator wants us to know that human beings do this sort of thing. And what might that be about? Could that be human shrewdness, slyness, aroomness, right on the precipice of that that follows? The reaction, as I said, is a cover-up, a hiding, a deflection of responsibility. But of the various consequences that then ensue, I want to focus in particular on what becomes of the relationship between the human beings at this point. For all three, the consequences are stated, for the snake, the male, and the female. The consequences are stated in terms of a set of parallel causes and effects, all arranged in poetic parallel. If you still have your sheet that I distributed in our first session together, 6 things to keep in mind when reading a Hebrew Bible text. The 5th is poetic parallelism. Biblical verses were, as I've suggested all along, originally intended to be chanted in Hebrew. They have a rhythm. The rhythm is more or less tight or loose, depending on the nature of the passage. When the rhythm is very loose, we call it prose, and in printed text today, it's written as if it's prose. When the rhythm tightens up, we call it poetry. The poetry has this one definitive characteristic, we've talked about this in the past, that it links clauses with some implicit relationship, unstated, as to the nature of that linkage. It might be a comparison, it might be a contrast, it might be cause and effect, it might be even more so, it might be opposition, it might be heaven and earth, but the nature of biblical poetry has these 2 qualities. One, that it's rhythmic, relatively loosely rhythmic, and 2, that clauses are put together that don't have any necessary immediate relationship to one another. The artistry of the poetry is in listening for what that relationship might be. So the consequences for each of these creatures as a result of what happened in Eden is stated in that poetic form. Typically, biblical narrative will move from loose to tight rhythm and these kinds of parallel constructions at certain points, sometimes purely for poetic purposes. This is the song the Israelites sang at the sea. But sometimes in the form of blessing, or oracle, or curse. And you see that construction in those contexts because it places us at the outer limit of language. And when you get to that horizon, that receding horizon of what language does well, that's typically what we look for poetry to help us with. And that's what happens here too. When the language moves to, this is to that place where we really don't know what to say, then it moves to tight poetic parallel construction. So, here are the consequences. And I'd like to look at verse 16 in particular. El haisha amar harba arbe itzvonech veheronech be'etzev teldi vanim ve'el ishech Chukatev v'hu yinshol bach. You can hear the rhythm there. Here's the parallel. It's actually 4 clauses linked together in one verse. A larger parallel and then 2 internal parallels. I'm going to translate it as closely as I can to the Hebrew. If you're interested in what I'm going to present in any greater detail, Carol Meyer's book, Discovering Eve, has a very effective discussion of this point. It's one of the books that I list in the outline of our series. So here's the translation. To the woman, God said, your toil, your travail, your trouble, and your pregnancies I will greatly multiply. That's what it says. Your toil or travail or troubles, your hurt, and your pregnancies I will greatly multiply. Clause 1. Clause 2. Your birthing of children will be with trouble, travail, and toil. Clause 3. You will yearn for your man, and here the conjunction is important. In Hebrew, this particular conjunction can mean any number of things. It can simply mean and, but it can also mean but. It can also mean though. You will yearn for your man, and, but, though, he will dominate you. So let me do this one more time. 4 clauses, 2 larger clauses, each of them subdivided into 2 smaller pairs. To the woman, God said, your toil, travail, trouble, and pregnancies will be greatly multiplied. And in trouble and toil you will birth children. And you will yearn for your man, and, but, though, even though, he will dominate you. That's how I translate it. Myers makes clear, and I think the Hebrew is quite clear, that what this verse does not say is it's going to be painful to give birth to babies. It probably does not say that. This is not a curse that leads directly to suffering associated with giving birth. It's far more subtle than that. Let me give you an example of the use of this word for pain or suffering or trouble or travail that sets it, I think, in quite a different light. The root, if anyone wants to pursue this, is ayin, sadi, vet. Ayin, sadi, vet. Here's a passage where the same root is used that I think sheds light on what we have here. An interesting parallel passage. It's in the 1st chapter of Kings. 1st chapter, 1 Kings. Story of David's decline. 1st chapter, 1 Kings. For those of you who do not have it memorized, or have the verse memorized but not the context. David is now old. He's literally impotent. The physical impotence of the man is juxtaposed to his losing grip of his kingdom. It's pretty clear that there's a metaphorical relationship between the two. And as this ensues, his son Adonijah attempts to prematurely seize the throne. Then Adonijah, the son of Haggith, raised himself up and said, I will be king. The text then says, parenthetically, verse 6, Velo atzavo aviv miyamav lemor madua kacha asita. And his father, that is David, never, and here's the word from the passage we're just reading in Genesis, never troubled, never pained, never caused discomfort in his son by saying, why are you doing that? It's a description in the negative of what happens when you never cause your children a bit of struggle over what they should or should not be doing. If you don't do this, the text implies, you get a spoiled and usurping son like Adonijah, essentially like all of David's children. David could not bring himself to say no to his own children. That's the verb. Now if you go back to this passage, to the woman God said, I will greatly multiply this verb, your suffering, your travail, your struggle, and your pregnancies, not in your pregnancies, not with your pregnancies, and your pregnancies, and once again, returning to the same root, with this struggle, with this suffering, travail, and toil, you will birth children. What's the difference between translating it that way and translating it, and it'll be very painful to give birth to children? You could translate it, it'll be very painful to give birth to children, but then the pain means something entirely different. You're going to have lots of this travail and lots of pregnancies. It doesn't even say birth in this connection. Yes, Connie?
Well, it's like my children might bring me heartache.
Right. You will suffer. You'll have lots of pregnancies. That's what the text says, which comes as a surprise. Oh, I'll have lots of pregnancies. And it'll come with repeated lots of this kind of ache. Yes?
It's the awareness of consequences again.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And so that's the first part of it. That's well put. Maybe ache is a good word, right? Does ache do it a little better than it'll having children, having pregnancies will come with ache. I believe Myers says the connection then between the travail and ache, as we may call it now, in pregnancy has specifically to do with the anxiety that ensues, not with the physical pain, but the state of mind that comes from knowing I'm going to be going through this, I could be going through this again and again and again, and I don't know what's going to happen. And that leads to the end of the verse, which in fact, though it is the second clause in the verse, probably should be understood as the cause. The second clause in this verse is the cause of the first. So here's the second clause. You will yearn for, you will be drawn to your man, though, even though, and he will dominate you. Now, let's be clear. That text does not say he should dominate you. He is naturally intended to dominate you. That there is anything right about him dominating you. It just says males will dominate you. And the irony, the terrible irony is they'll dominate you because you want it. Because you want it. Oh, they'll dominate you because you want it. That's a much, much more interesting and troubling, but richer reading of the verse. You will yearn for males, and this yearning will in turn lead to male control and multiple pregnancies, which will come with age. There's no indication that this is necessary, it's not natural, it's not just. On the contrary, we know what the natural and the just condition is. It was described at creation, that human beings, male and female, all human beings, by dint of being human, are in the divine image. There is no indication that by creation, human beings are anything other than human. Not necessary, not just, not natural. It's just what's going to happen. That's what's going to happen. You could even say that might be what's going to happen because you now have this awareness of self. If it's a consequence of the new consciousness that human beings carry with them, and the fact that relationships between genders are now all entangled with this conscious, subconscious awareness of self. You might call this a kind of critical realism in biblical text. It's characteristic of biblical narrative, including biblical narrative as it treats gender-based social inequality, as it does at many points. When gender-based social inequality emerges in biblical text, the text is real about the fact that some genders typically dominate others. It doesn't justify that. It doesn't attempt to theologize that fact. It acknowledges the fact. And that's why you have so many women who are successful guerrilla fighters in the war of gender domination. Women who succeed in worlds that are accurately described as male-dominated. They succeed despite the domination. The biblical text is often sympathetic to their circumstances. Hannah, Rachel, other women typify this status. The women who dominate the opening chapters of the book of Exodus. But the text is real about the social fact that women do this in a world in which they are entangled with males who dominate them. I want to make two more observations before we leave. The first is that as the human beings are leaving, suddenly the male turns to his female companion and gives her a name. What do you make of that? And gives her a name.
It's control on it.
It is, yes. Naming is controlling it. The fact that the text attributes the naming of the woman, who up until this point has only been the woman, to the male, is a subtle reference to that power. He names her. Finally, as I observed last week at the luncheon, as we're leaving Eden, something occurs that I find terrifically moving, poignant, and highly significant. Verse 21, chapter 3. As the human beings are on the verge of being driven from Eden, then the God, made for the human being, male and female, coats of skin and dressed them. What's so poignant about Then God makes them coats of skin and dresses. How did dressing come into the world?
It's something directly in response to their new awareness.
Right. Dressing is invented in that moment of crisis. The human beings devise dressing to help them cover themselves up. And at this moment in the story, we find God cooperating, collaborating in the cover-up. This is a God who cannot bear to see the kids go out in the cold without a coat. This is a God who now well knows more than the human beings know, that the fig leaf is an inadequate cover for the world as it is, an inadequate cover for our arumas. We're somewhat shielded from the consequences of our actions. But this is a God who says, tell you what, to make a go of it in the world, you're going to need to cover a little better than that. This is a God who loves us so much, this God even helps us cover ourselves.
It almost has the sense of regret.
Yeah.
Regret that they aren't like God.
Yes, but, and yet, unlike any other God, this God doesn't write us off. Instead says, it's just too much. You need coats before you go. It's terrifically moving and so extraordinarily eccentric as gods of antiquity go. Yes, please.
I'm wondering if this is the first time God has killed any of his creation?
It would seem
to
so.
give a
Yes,
fur
it
to
seems-
somebody.
yes, for them.
They didn't eat meat before
Yes,
that.
that's right.
So God was doing the first sacrifice.
For them. Yes, that's right. It's also, needless to say, without speaking of genders per se, it is so classically maternal. Is this a maternal act?
Yeah.
You're going to need this, even if I'm helping you to get away with something that was a mistake to begin with. It's beautiful. It's just really beautiful. Please.
It's that last point you said that I wanted to ask about, because when God says, now that you've explained it, it's a fact you're going to suffer.
Right, right.
You're going to be a mother, you're going to have
Right.
motherhood, you're going to suffer.
Right.
And now, what I would like to jump to is, I will suffer right along with you.
Well, we'll see. Yes, that's right. That's right. If you're going to hold on to this relationship, it would seem that would be inevitable, and that a suffering God would inevitably follow. Yes, that's right. No doubt about it. Because the alternative, which is the typical divine thing to do, is to write them off. What losers! I'll just do it over again. Buber, see, if I just to go a little bit further, Buber sees what is now going to ensue in the closing verses of chapter 3 as an elaboration of this book. And he cites, as I said last week, one of his contemporaries, a Christian pastor by the name of Otto Protzk, who insisted that when God decides that the human beings must leave Eden, lest they eat from the tree of life and also live forever, as in the story of Babel several chapters later, we don't have a story of divine fear of human audacity, but a story, once again, of divine love. Buber, citing Proch, reads the exit from Eden as God's act of protecting human beings now, just as they need to be protected with cover that really works, must be protected from an eternal life with the consciousness they now possess. As they once may have been, eternal life may have been a possibility. But you and I, as we are now, if we knew that there was no trajectory, there was no end, there was no limit to living as we are, would ultimately find it unbearable. And leaving Eden isn't punishment, it's grace. Now with this consciousness, human beings must know that there's an end. And that end is a comfort of hers. As I said last week, although this takes us quite far afield, that immediately raises for us an interesting distinction between the twin and sometimes blurred traditions of eternal life and resurrection from the dead. They're really two very different ideas. And the second, resurrection of the dead, would seem, in this respect, to be far more closely associated with biblical consciousness than would eternal life. Okay, so, yes, please, thanks for your patience.
The God making clothes, skins for Adam
Yes.
seems to suggest, it seems to me, that the first meaning of Adam
Yes.
is naked.
Yes?
But what you're saying is maybe so, but at the same time, because of its cognate,
Yes.
thing, by listening,
Yes.
hearing, they may have heard also this other, maybe they did, maybe they didn't.
Uh-huh.
So that it could, in their minds, suggest get away from the physical outward, but the inward
Yes,
cleverness. and so
cleverness.
forth.
Yes, that's right, yes.
So in other words, you're not ruling out naked.
No, no. The pun only works if you have them oscillating, one against the other. That's the point. It's not a choice, it's an ambiguity that leads simultaneously in both possible directions. Yes. Let me close then with this. I had hoped to talk about Cain and Abel. Let me just say,
You'll be back. I hope.
thank you, Let me just say, it's in Cain and Abel that the word sin first appears in the biblical text. Sin is never referenced in Eden. First sin, the arch sin, is fratricide. It appears in God's warning. Sin crouches, waiting for you at the door. And in Cain's acknowledgement, now bearing that same consciousness, I cannot bear my sin. What Cain seems to say is, I cannot bear living now with the awareness of what I've done. I think the story of Cain circulates around that introduction of sin. It's crucial to what Hebrew Bible means by sin. I would only add in this regard, the story of Cain and Abel only makes sense to us as real human beings if we keep in mind Cain never gets an answer for why God didn't take a sacrifice. The premise of the story is he did good. He did the best he could. He did it first. His little brother tried to steal his thunder and got away with it. And do we know that feeling? Only every day of our lives. We do what we can, we do it well, we try our best. No answer. It'll make you do some crazy things. Okay. And yet, even here, when sin does first enter the world in the form of fratricide, this God cannot abandon even the inventor of murder. And so the protective mark, the sign of Cain, like the coats of skin, a provision for the world as it now is. And by the time then we get to Genesis 12, when the narrative firmly sets down in a world we recognize as far more like our own, human beings will thus be equipped for history. Now somewhat covered from our aroomness, somewhat shielded from the consequences of our own actions, now in the world as we know it. And with that, the story of Israel begins. Thank you very much.
First, my apologies for not having Bibles out for you, although, you should be responsible to bring your own. I will still keep hoping that. But most importantly, this is a conversation that must continue, and we are more than significantly enriched by the last 4 weeks. So thank you very much.